Good morning. I'm Vince Cunningham. I'm a business advisor with CBBC, normally based in the north of England. My background actually is process engineering. I spent 5 years making Mars bars and chocolates along the valley in Slough. My introduction to China was just over 10 years ago when a small company I was with, an SME, sold process engineering technology, and I went out to deliver it and build a factory. So compared to Paul, I'm going to be very general. I'm going to talk a bit about the background of China and how that fits in with the opportunities. Touch on Chinese business culture, which is quite different to ours. I'm going to pick up a couple of the FAQs that are asked, particularly by companies that are new to market, and then talk a little bit about market entry and building the market up. Very general terms, since China began to open up to foreign investment, the growth in China has been 10% per annum, very consistent over the past 30-something years. And we read in the papers that is China falling off the cliff, the growth has slowed down, etc. Well, in fact, last year, Chinese growth came in at about 7.8%. This year, it's expected to be above 7.5% per annum. So you compare that to the sort of growth that we've got in this country and added to the opportunities that Paul's talked about, gives you something of the scenario there. But that growth in China has been built on that thing at the top, the made in China, manufacturing for other people. And that's led to consequences. Paul's talked about the environmental consequences, but you can see it everywhere in China. The photographs there I've taken deliberately to try and show the differences that there are in Chinese society. And those were taken about half a mile away from each other in Shanghai. And I didn't have to wait very long for somebody to go past the Bentley garage on the bicycle. The tricycle actually is a business tricycle, and the owner of that tricycle, I don't think of the two kids there, but that's their business, and it's collecting garbage to recycle, a cottage industry. So this growth has left lots of gaps, and there's no such thing as one China. And the gaps are everywhere. We've talked about environmental gaps. There are gaps in technology, there are gaps in marketing skills, there are gaps in management skills. But something to be aware of in China is that everything is changing. And what is relevant today is perhaps not what was relevant a year ago, and it's going to be different in 2 or 3 years' time. And it's definitely not a single market. I'll come back to that in a moment. But for UK companies, we've talked a lot about the clean energy and the environmental sector this morning. There's opportunities in every area, but it's certainly not the sort of high volume, and it's ceasing to be the opportunities to source in China, source cheaply. The example I've used at the bottom is a year old, but it really chimed with me. 2011, it's an HSBC figure, 55,000 UK motor cars exported to China, but just look at the value of them. And that value is going through UK customs. So we're not selling the Chinese Ford cars. So if anybody has any doubts about whether there's money in China, that answers it. The loft houses, Fisherman Friend, is at the other end of the spectrum. And beside any supermarket checkout, you'll find those. Another British product, very popular in China. But it's 6,000 miles away, it speaks a different language, different regulatory system, and it does require perseverance to succeed in China. And sometimes I'm asked, well, if I go to China, is there a quick fix? Well, there isn't. You've got to be in China for the long run. And if you're in China for the long run and you have the right product, right technology, it can be very lucrative indeed. I've been out with many trade missions, and one of the things that I find people sometimes going to somewhere like Shanghai or Beijing, China looks just the same as it does here. People nowadays dress the same. The shops are full of Western goods. You get Premier League, Arsenal, Chelsea, Newcastle United, Manchester United on television, and people are very hospitable, and sometimes that can be misleading. because you get businesses come back and say, I had a great 3 weeks in China, they're going to come to me with a business. You need to be just a little bit careful, and this is an old Chinese proverb. I'm not going to read it out, I'll let you read it. So you've got to be careful. You've got to have your eyes open in China, and you've got to be aware that first impressions are not necessarily the things that you can take away and simply judge China on. Talking about the business culture initially, it comes from very different drivers. China's view of itself as the Middle Kingdom goes back, not centuries, it goes back millennia. And China claims 5,000 years of continuous history. And that's the difference between the West and China, that the history is continuous in China. So there's a very much a sense of China being the centre of things. For 18 of the last 20 centuries, China has been the biggest economy in the world. And that only fell over about 150 years ago. And the Chinese look at the period from 1840 on as a century of shame. Since 1949, it's had a single-party government. It's a communist country. And in China, still popular today, books of war stratagems 2,500 years ago. One of the main philosophies in China, and one that China is promoting very actively, is the philosophy of Confucius. Harmony in society through structure. So there's a lot of different things going on that got to make up Chinese business culture, and they're different to the ones the things that drive our culture. And that's the result. I hope that's okay to read at the back, but the blue column are things that either I learned to do, or sometimes I was trained to do. Efficient meetings where we all stood up. Egalitarian workforces, empowerment, the contract being binding, variations to contract and always going back to the contract. These can be very different in China, and you need to be aware of that. There's many more situations where people don't act as individuals, they will act as a group. But that can be a little bit deceptive, because the decision is normally made on a hierarchical basis, and simply taking yes out of a meeting as being a commitment can be a big mistake. The social side of doing business is very important in China, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, but if you're invited out to dinner after some of these one-to-ones that Paul talks about, take the opportunity, because that's where you may meet the people who can make the decisions. You may find that you're being sussed out in the beginning. And FACE, before I went to China, I read all about FACE. When I went to China, I was told, forget it, Vince, that's old China. It isn't. Now, FACE is important to all of us, but it's very important in China. And don't put somebody in a corner and expect to do business with them after you've done that. I still go back to that book. It's out of print now. It was written in the mid-1990s. I bought it. I'd been working in China for 3 months, and there were times when I really couldn't understand what was going on. Bought it at Pudong Airport, and I read the book, including all the case studies and references, by the time the plane cleared Russian airspace. It's still available. It's a very, very practical book. But just some things to be aware of. We talked a bit about the need to have patience, the need to develop relationships, and you need to do that to get win-win situations. Hands-off in China is very dangerous for all sorts of reasons. And sometimes people think that China is low cost, and that can mean low overhead. In fact, sometimes it can mean the opposite. Because, again, it comes back to this risk of hands-off in China. Just touching on some of the things that are frequently asked questions by companies, particularly new to the market. Intellectual property, well, basically, the laws are as good as ours. The enforcement in China is improving. It is improving more slowly than most of us would like. And it can be quite regional, and I'll touch on that again in a moment or two. Something to be aware of in particular is trademarks. As a first to register environment, if your trademark or your logos are important to you and you're going to be exposed in China, go to the market, have a website presence, etc., do look at those and do have them registered. I take legal and practical steps. Everything you do with intellectual property, it isn't just legal. And some of them are things like retaining technology, not giving all of your information over in one go. Moving on to the financial areas, the currency, well, it's still a controlled currency. It's opening up, but it's opening up quite gradually. When I first went to China, you couldn't buy renminbi outside of China, and maybe one or two exchange places at airports. And now I think you can get it at Marks and Spencer's. But again, that's deceptive. It is controlled. Payments for things like contracts, dividends being paid if you set up a company in China, they go through the banking system and it's audited by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. And generally, if you play by the rules of payments match contracts, accounts are audited before dividends are paid, you don't have a problem. But to do something on a contract that's outside of the contract and expect payment later, my advice would be to be careful there. Single party government. It can get legislation through quickly. It doesn't answer to an external authority like the EU. It can be very quick, but there can also be local interpretation. So where Paul talks about access to the provincial government, that's extremely important, because you're not selling to Beijing, you're actually selling to companies too and politicians in these cities and these regions in China. It can, and I've seen this with payment, it can be an excuse. So again, if you're trying to do complex business in China and you're trying to do it remotely rather than setting up if you're doing a lot of business, or working with good local agents who can help you, you can find that you're offered excuses for a delayed payment, or you have to do this or that, and it can be very difficult to resolve from here. So again, China isn't hands off. And some of the things with China, for example, setting up a company, if you're setting up a trading company, it can take about 8 months, because you have to go through all sorts of procedures and get all sorts of approvals before you can operate. Generally, and touching on or connecting with what Paul's talking about, the trade mission, you can actually find out a lot about China without leaving your desk. The information that Paul's talked about, there's a lot of information available on the internet. There's information from our website, from the UKTI website. But sooner or later, you're in a position where if you're selling something complex or doing something complex, you're going to have to go to the market. If you're going to go to the market, you need to be very specific and present yourself well. And I talk here about tailoring your offer to the market, Chinese plus. The Chinese bit is fairly obvious. If you write it in English, people may be able to read it, but what message are you giving? If you're sent something in German, what message does it give you? And the plus part is you've got to be very specific about why the Chinese should deal with you, what your USP is, what you're going to do for them, the benefits that you're going to deliver. And that's very important in entering the market. Going to the market for a visit is very often the first step. You've got to build relationships, you've got to build up a network, and if you set up anything, whether it's a company or whether it's perhaps a technical trial, you've got to be very careful to support it, because if you don't support it, by the time you find out what's going on, it won't be what you want to be going on. I meet companies who've been to China, had wonderful visits, come back and they say, well, nobody's written to me. I had all of these great meetings. Well, sometimes that's just cultural. You've got to be prepared to be proactive and follow up the connections that you make on your visits to China. You might need to be flexible in your approach to the market. So if you're selling a technology, like I was, and the factory there is one that I built in Shanghai 10 years ago, We'd sent equipment all over the world from the UK. China would buy some key equipment, but they also wanted to buy royalties to use the technology. So you've got to be flexible with that, and that approach is generally known as being prepared to localize. You might need a presence in the market. So if you're doing something complex, if you're supporting operations, if you're selling something technical, if you're dealing with a number of agents, distributors, then you've got to look fairly quickly at having something in the market. And there's lots of sources of advice. The one thing I would say is that you sometimes get somebody who talks to you about the XYZ development zone in a particular Chinese city. Just be careful. Look at your options, because sometimes that can be a little bit specific. Presence, I've mentioned the reasons to have that. And sometimes it's as simple as showing commitment to the market, especially in areas of technology. But be aware that the market is split into different sectors. Most of the time you would be operating in an area where investment in the market is encouraged. If you were doing something like education, then you would need a local partner for a joint venture. And if you are planning to employ somebody in China, under Chinese law, you need to have a registered company in China to employ that person through. It's actually illegal for a foreign company to directly employ a Chinese person. And sometimes people set these relationships up and they don't last. They last a few months and then they fall apart. We quite often get companies coming to us for help in that situation. The main types of presence that you can have in China, well, the simple one is a non-trading presence. It cannot invoice, it cannot actively sell. It's a representative office, or sometimes you can be offered incubation facilities. We have a service like that we call Launchpad that we can offer through 11 of our offices. The joint venture I've mentioned and the two logos at the top are examples of that. What you see is the foreign part of the company, but very often nowadays to get access to the Chinese market, you actually need to have a joint venture partner. And then in many sectors you can have a wholly owned organisation, but you've got to be aware there that you need to develop the market relationships. Just rounding off with where we are. We're in 8 locations throughout the UK. We're now in 13 locations in China. And I think we're in all of the cities that you're visiting with your market visit, Paul?
Yeah.
We are a membership organisation. The magazine on the table is ours, and there's some information at the back of the room. We work very closely with UK Trade and Investment. We deliver their business-to-business services in China, but we have a number of specialist services ourselves. And again, there's information at the back, or pick me up over lunch. And just to prove that we've been around for a while, we go back to the early 1950s when a group of British companies wanted to retain trading links with China. Hence, I've got a black and white picture to prove that. We work at every level, from working with SMEs. The centre at the bottom is a small company from the northeast that I was in China with during the summer. We also work at government levels.